LBC. From Global, leading Britain's conversation, the Nigel Farage Show.
Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. Well, I'm here in Strasbourg, where Jean-Claude Juncker is the centre of everything, because on Wednesday he gives his State of the Union speech. Now, it's a very grand title, but then Juncker, in many ways, is a very grand person. He is, after all, President of the European Commission. He is the most powerful man in Europe. And this speech, this week, is being trailed very heavily. One feature that I think is really interesting is one of his spokesmen said he will not talk about Brexit. Not at all, said the source. And the reason is he doesn't want his presidency of the European Commission to be defined by Brexit. I'd have thought it's a bit late for that, personally, but never mind. Legacy is something that people in senior positions always worry about. So what's he going to do? He's going to stand up and give, I say, a bold vision, the same one I guess he's been giving for 20 years. He's going to put down a blueprint to create a federal Eurozone finance minister and treasury. He's going to get an even big agenda going for deeper EU integration. He's calling it a European renaissance. And he thinks that because Macron won in France in the presidential elections, that all is fine and dandy with the European Union. We're told from the source they will be very new and powerful ideas. I doubt it. I think it'll be more of the same. I think it will be a proposal to put us very, very close to being a United States of Europe. But, some people have warned, he risks alienating parts of society which feel the EU lacks legitimacy or has already taken too much power. So my question to you is, if you were Mr. Juncker, given that one of the biggest countries in the European Union, given that we, and our economy, by the way, is as big as the 20 smallest member states, given that we're leaving, what does he need to do to keep the European project on track? Really, what I'm saying is, does the European Union need to integrate more deeply or to loosen a little? What do you think Juncker should do in this speech? Let me know by calling me on 0345 6060 973, text me at 84850, tweet at LBC using the hashtag Farage and LBC, follow us on Facebook Live, comment on Facebook too. Keen to hear opinions from absolutely anybody, especially if you're living within the European Union. And you may think Brexit is a good thing or a bad thing, but what does Juncker need to do on Wednesday in this big speech? Well, I'll be sitting, as ever, on Wednesday morning in seat number 20, and Mr. Juncker will be there in seat number 21. We'll be about 4.5, 5 feet between us. I have to say, on a personal level, I find him really rather good fun. He's jolly. He likes a joke. He likes to drink, of course, too. He's well known for that. But he is actually a very friendly fellow. But when it comes to politics, I have to say I find him just a little bit scary. I mean, for example, here is a Junckerism. National borders are the worst invention ever. That's right. He thinks that borders should just be abolished and we should all move around freely and not have any sense of nationality. And the thing that I found the most sinister about Juncker is when we've talked about the Irish saying no to the Lisbon Treaty, the British voting for Brexit. This is a direct quote from Jean-Claude Juncker. He said, "There can be no democratic choice against the European treaties." That's quite frightening, isn't it? He's saying, we've set this up, we've got our treaties, we're happy as Larry, and there's nothing you can do about it. And my other favourite Junckerism, and this is from a few years ago, and this is when he was leading the Eurozone group through its crisis. He was the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, and he said, and in a way, I guess this next quote you should perhaps respect for his honesty in a very strange way. He said, when it becomes serious, you have to lie. How about that? This is the man leading the European Union. He's going to stand up on Wednesday morning. I'll be there right next to him. He is going to put forward a blueprint for Europe to integrate very much more deeply. My own view is this. They can con themselves that because Macron beat Le Pen in the runoff for the French presidency, that all is well in the garden. Actually, if you look at the first round of the French presidency, 46.5% of people voted for candidates who are secessionists from the EU, something unthinkable 10 years ago. Just last week, we saw a court case in which Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic and Slovakia are being told they must take migrant quotas from people who've come in across the Mediterranean because Juncker and Merkel say so, and they're still saying no. So the East and West split hugely on the migrant issue. And as far as the euro is concerned, well, Greece literally being turned into a third world country because it joined the euro and it's being forced to stay there. So I think there's deep instability within the European project. There are political movements on the left, the centre and the right that have sprung up over Europe in the course of the last few years. Yeah, sure, we've not had Brexit this year. We've not had Trump this year. But what we have seen are Eurosceptics still gaining ground. And to me, the lesson of Brexit and what Juncker should be doing on Wednesday is standing up and acknowledging. In a way, Blair did a bit of this yesterday. Acknowledging we've made terrible mistakes. We've got things wrong. That's why the Brits have left. And for the rest of you, do you know what we're going to do? We're going to give power back to the people. We're going to hand decision-making back to national parliaments and to individual voters. We've learnt the lesson of Brexit. And if he was to say that, I think public opinion across Europe would say, well, OK, they're being reasonable. They've learnt. But instead, they're going in the opposite direction. And I wonder what Trevor in Basingstoke makes of that. Good evening.
Good evening.
So, Trevor, you know, it's Wednesday. You're there. You're in charge, Trevor. Britain's about to leave. What's the big message?
The first thing I'd ask for is a set of audited accounts, please.
Oh no, don't be so ridiculous. No. Now, come on, Trevor. We're only in the 21st year. And I guess, to be fair, you know, this is the auditors saying that they cannot sign them off as an accurate and true record because of the level of fraud, which is estimated to run at about 5 billion a year. All right, so so should Juncker demand a fresh set of accounts? Should he be bashing the officials at the Commission to make sure this happens?
Well, presently acts more like Sepp Blatter running FIFA. And not a superstate.
Right, so the money side of it's no blooming good. What else should he do?
Well, I think, as you're rightly saying, he should give the democracy back to the people who own the democracy.
Yes, well, that, Trevor, is my view. But you know what? He doesn't believe in that, and nor did his predecessors. And I never forget, when the Irish did vote against the Lisbon Treaty, his predecessor, Mr. Barroso, former Maoist and former Prime Minister of Portugal, stood up and said, when the Irish voted no, they didn't mean no. And you think, you know, what planet are these people on? Trevor, do you think that with Brexit happening, with the east-west tensions on migration, the north-south tensions on the euro, finance and money, and Juncker clearly having learnt nothing from this, do you think the EU's days are numbered, Trevor?
Well, I don't think it can continue, but my long-term fear is that when it does disintegrate, it disintegrates into war, because there's nothing in between. So the only good thing of the EU project has been that it's prevented a catastrophic war since 1945.
You know, even that, Trevor, assumes that the Germans are such evil people that they would have crossed the Rhine again post-1945. And I don't believe that for a moment. I do not think that modern-day Germany would have even contemplated such a thing. That's my view. But Trevor,
I don't think it'll be that. It'll become civil war between all the nations that would end up hating each other, as was seen in the Balkans.
Well, but you could argue the reason for the Balkans, Trevor, was they were all forced together in something called Yugoslavia against their will, and that's why any old rivalries and new ones as well sprung out. But Trevor, I hope you're wrong. with that, but I thank you for the call. And I'm going to ask Fred in Teddington. Fred, you're in charge. You're the governor. You're standing up in the European Parliament on Wednesday. What do you say?
Well, the first thing is to acknowledge that the doctrine of convergence, which is what they are now pushing with a new treasury for the whole, and a military force to cover the whole of the European Union, is wrongly based. It cannot work. Look, Nigel, we've got a problem. Economic and political philosophy today, wherever it's applied, not just the European Union, cannot solve the problems, and I'll illustrate the point. Where the European Union says we must head for convergence, right? They are actually following a set of economic principles that creates divergence, which is why we have Southern Europe and Eastern Europe in the state that, as you quite rightly say, is knocking Greece back into the third world domain.
So basically, Fred, the euro didn't bring the countries closer together, it split them. No. That's what you're really saying, isn't it?
Yes, but you see, getting your political independence, sovereignty, as under Brexit, will not solve that problem. And look, the United States is a sovereign free nation, and it has exactly the same problems of divergence, tension, and the rest of it that has caused the populism in Europe. Over there, it's led to President Trump. So there is a fundamental flaw which, unfortunately, even UKIP has not resolved, but it's there to be solved if some political party finds the solution. But simply saying, let's revert to political independence, will not of itself solve the economic problems.
But is Juncker making a mistake in the light of Brexit to push hard for deeper integration at this moment in time?
He will be magnifying the problems that already exist deeper into the territory, and Britain is undoubtedly better off out of it.
Fred, thank you very much indeed. Points clearly made that actually sometimes the effect of policies is the opposite to what you set them up to be. I'm asking you, what should Jean-Claude Juncker do on Wednesday in his big State of the Union speech? Should the EU integrate more deeply, or should it start to hand powers back to member states? You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC, live from Strasbourg, and it's 7:15. As the European Parliament braces itself for Jean-Claude Juncker's big speech on Wednesday, his State of the Union speech, his launching of a new European renaissance, I'm asking you, should he deepen integration in what's left of the European Union more deeply, or should he actually learn the lessons from Brexit and start to give some powers back to voters and member states? And of course, whilst that's happening here, the big debate's happening in Parliament today. The vote's going to be around about midnight, and we'll hear later on in the show from Theo Usherwood, who's there in Westminster, what's going on and how big the Labour rebellion is. Quite interesting. There are quite a lot of Labour MPs who know they've got big Brexit votes in their constituency, really worried about the U-turn the Labour Party's done when it says it now wants to stay in the single market and the customs union for at least the transitional period, and senior Labour figures. And even today, actually, Corbyn saying, well, it could become a permanent thing. So let's sort of assess that. And also, later in the show, I am going to tell you something about the BBC, about a news report they did on me last year, which in some ways contributed to changing my life and not for the better. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in the show. And without doubt, they'll be the strongest comments I've ever made about the BBC, who pretend to be neutral, but frankly are anything but. And on Juncker, Graham says Juncker needs to get rid of the euro, the EU Commission, and revert to a loosey union of independent democratic states who control their own borders. Graham, it's not going to happen. Juncker is going in the opposite direction. I understand what you say. Gary in Blackpool, I think maybe has the right answer as to what Juncker should do on Wednesday. Easy. Tender his resignation. Well, again, I don't think Mr. Juncker is in the mood to do that, but it's fun, and Juncker should understand there must not be a United States of Europe. There is no controversy in wanting to have sovereign, healthy, independent countries. Well, so far, you're all saying that what Juncker needs to do is to loosen the European Union, not to tighten the European Union. But tightening it is what he intends to do. And I wonder what James in Manchester makes of that. James, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. I don't think we'll ever get rid of the union model and go back to a nation-state having whole of power as you may want. I think as the world becomes more interconnected in the 21st century, if it's not the European Union, it's going to be another union in the future, which may be more all-encompassing. So in terms of...
Do you know, James, I disagree with that completely. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you what I think is interesting, that you get this argument that in the modern world we need to be big countries or part of big blocs. But, James, my observation is, you know, over the last several decades, every single year we get a new country. That actually the world, James, is breaking down into smaller units based on the principle of national self-determination. And I think the idea of these big blocks, frankly, James, I think it's history.
Really? Well, I can see your points of view, and as a salesperson myself, I have to admire someone like yourself and how you present your ideas. I just think that the world's different now. When I studied politics at university, the nation-state model, for me, as a conservative, it didn't seem the best model, but it seemed the best of a bad bunch. Whereas the world's changing, I think that the nation-state model is something of the past, but I do appreciate your views as well.
Well, James, you know, and that point of view is one that many people have put to me, you know, in all the years I've been doing this. But all I would say, James, is look at the evidence, and the evidence, I think, suggests that actually we're getting more nation-states as years go by. But your first point, of course, is right, that we are living in a more interconnected world. But just because you're interconnected, just because you can travel more easily and hopefully post-Brexit do business even more easily, doesn't mean that voters and people want to give up the idea that they're actually in control. And so that's the point I'd make. But, James, I thank you for your call. James feeling that the nation-state maybe has had its day. I don't think that's how people in the world feel. I wonder what Sam in Burton makes of this debate. Good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. But I think that Juncker and his little friends over there in the European Parliament, they're trying to delude themselves and live in a fantasy world in those four walls where the past issues of Brexit and all that never happened. They're trying to forget about it. So in my opinion, Juncker, he needs to acknowledge those past mistakes and he needs to learn from them.
So, Sam, if you were me, right, because I'm going to be sitting right next to him, I shall listen to his speech and I will get my chance to comment. If you were me, what would you say to him?
Well, I would say to him just that. I mean, that it's scary that we have people in positions of power that aren't going to try to learn from their past mistakes. I mean, that's incredibly scary, and that's the point I'd make.
Well, it's even worse than that, Sam. It's even worse than that because, you know, his official, and I'll quote the official again about Juncker, he will not talk about Brexit, not at all, and the reason is he doesn't want his long political career and indeed his final job as president of the European Commission to be defined by Brexit. I mean, he's in denial, isn't he?
Oh, he is indeed. You're exactly right on that. You're exactly right.
I don't know. I haven't yet worked out what I'm going to say, but maybe something like, Jean-Claude, he's behind you. You know, it's actually happening. It's bizarre, isn't it? I mean, it really is. But you find this scary, Sam, do you?
Yeah, I find it scary because people need to be learning from their past mistakes. I mean, that's one of the number one things to do just throughout life. And the fact that he's just trying to sweep this under the rug and not acknowledge it, that is scary to me. So I'll be interested to hear what you've got to say to him.
Right. Well, do you know what, Sam? So will I, because I haven't worked it out yet. But I thank you very much indeed for your call. Lloyd says to me by text, I would point out to Mr. Juncker that if the EU does not bend, then it will break. Can I please get some supporters for Juncker? I want to hear from you. Maybe you're listening from Luxembourg. And hopefully Michael Caine's comment last week that up until the age of 20, he thought Luxembourg was a radio station, hasn't offended you too much. But please, someone out there tell me Juncker is a good guy. Robert's getting that way. He says, I'd rather have Juncker and the EU than the Tories rewriting the Constitution behind closed doors. Well, that very debate, Robert, we'll have in a few minutes' time when we go to Theo Usherwood and we hear the reasons why Labour, officially as a party, is opposing the Brexit bill. But next, it's Michael in Chichester. Michael, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel.
So, you're Jean-Claude Juncker for a day. What do you do?
Well, I think ultimately that he's just completely not wired to take in what's going on. He's not a democratic politician, so he's not going to respond to all the things that he should do, like Gareth just said in the text message about taking on board. He won't do that. So let Juncker be Juncker. Let him go out there and actually give his federalist vision. Let him ignore Brexit and go out singing the song he's singing all his life. Let him sing to the choir with Hofstad and let him take it in. And I think it would be good for Britain. Think about Britain's interest, because the more these people just close their ears and carry on in their same unreformed way, I think they're going to lead to more nation states emerging to reassert their sovereignty, like Denmark and so forth. It won't happen straight away. It's not going to be a domino effect we've seen, but it will be people recognizing that they now know there's a choice. It's not just about a single market. It's not about the economy. It's about these people who have a federalist vision. It's purer. It's more honest. It's the thing that Nick Clegg should be saying. He should be saying, I love Europe. I want to have a European vision. Let Juncker say that. Let him be honest to himself. And I think the challenge that you should pose to him is to say, all well and good, and I know you're scared of what you call populism, but everyone else calls democracy. How about you say, yes, have your vision, have your, but then turn yourself as a commission president, put yourself to a vote, take more power.
Now, I think that, Michael, democracy. I like that. I think that's brilliant. So, Mr. Juncker, set up your grand ministries and your centralised, and your army, of course, while you're at it.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Please, if you're a Democrat, would you put this vision to every member state in a referendum to see if the people agree? Would you like me to say that, Michael, on Wednesday?
Absolutely, go ahead. And if they want to carve it down to the 6 nations that want it, I can't think what 6 nations would want it. The people, I say, not the elites of those nations, the people. Yes. But let them face the music and let them do it. But let them be honest with the people. Stop thinking that Brexit should have taught them that they've been rumbled after 50 years of just telling people that it's something else. It's not about federalism. Brexit has rumbled that.
No, well, I have to say, Michael, I'm at one with you on all of that, and thank you for your suggestion. So we're asking you what you'd say if you were Jean-Claude Juncker. We're also asking you what I should say to Jean-Claude Juncker. So far, not much support for the idea that Juncker should go on more deeply centralising the project. In fact, it may well lead to total disaster. Reminds me of the poem, First World War poem. Good morning, said the General, good morning. He's a cheery old chap, said Albert to Jack, as up they went with rifle and pack. But he did for 'em both with his plan of attack. And maybe Juncker will be destroying the very Europe that he loves by pushing too far, too fast. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It is 8:30 here. As Jean-Claude Juncker prepares to launch his European renaissance with deeper still integration in Europe in the face of Brexit, the House of Commons, of course, today is not just debating again, but will later on tonight vote on the repeal bill. And whilst the Prime Minister, I understand, is confident of winning, the Labour Party are putting up, I understand, some fierce opposition. They're arguing that clauses within the bill give too much powers to ministers. Theo Usherwood, BBC's political correspondent, is going to tell us what's going on. Theo, hello.
It has all backfired, Nigel, spectacularly on Labour. This was supposed to be a way for Jeremy Corbyn and his shadow front bench to undermine the Conservatives, tabling what's known as a reasoned amendment at second reading to the government's EU withdrawal bill, along the lines of the fact that there was this power grab with these laws from the European Union dating back to 1972 and the European Communities Act being transposed into British law, but without any scrutiny from the House of Commons or the House of Lords. They tabled this amendment, which in effect would have killed the legislation before it got to any further stages, hoping that Conservative Remainers would come on side and support them. That hasn't happened. I bumped into Anna Soubry, the MP for Broxtowe Arch, Remain this morning, and she said she wasn't taking part. None of her like-minded colleagues on the Conservative benches were taking part. They're going to wait to committee stage to put forward some actual amendments, proper changes to the legislation. So it's backfired because now we have this split between Jeremy Corbyn, who is, supported Sir Keir Starmer, his shadow Brexit secretary, on this. That's where the ideas come from, the likes of Chukwuemeka, Wes Streeting, the moderates within the Labour Party, and then people, MPs, Labour MPs, many, of course, in traditional heartland constituencies in the north of England, where there was a strong Brexit support in last June's referendum. I'm talking about people like Caroline Flint, Graham Stringer, and then there was this intervention from the Labour veteran Frank Field.
Tonight I will be voting for the only option for the referendum result to be implemented. That was the wish of my constituents, and that was the wish of the country. And I don't wish there to be any different view put forward about whose side I'm on. I'm on the side of the majority of people who voted to come out.
No doubt there from Frank Field about who he's supporting the government. So when the final numbers come in, firstly on the amendment just after midnight, and then the actual bill itself at around 12:30, it's likely to score 360, 370, playing 290, 295. It will be a comfortable win for the government, because not only have they managed to rouse their own MPs and make sure that they stay on side, remain MPs, the likes of, as I referred to, Dominic Grieve, Anna Soubry, Nicky Morgan, but they've also managed to create this wedge in the Labour, amongst the Labour ranks, and therefore many Labour MPs are actually going to be supporting the government, or like Frank Field, or simply abstaining. And then Jeremy Corbyn has more discipline issues within the parliamentary party.
So the story changes, Theo. We've had decades of Tory splits on the EU, and now maybe we're entering a phase of Labour splits on the EU.
Absolutely, and Labour now seem to have embarked on this policy of mass confusion. Jeremy Corbyn was on the airwaves at lunchtime saying that Labour was now open for discussion about whether the UK remains in the EU single market. Remember, of course, the Labour policy was until lunchtime, at least today, that we wouldn't remain within the single market after the transitional arrangements which kick in March 2019. So looking further ahead, Labour now saying that there was a discussion about the issue. There's been pushback on that from a number of MPs, and actually there are people, Nigel, who think that this is intentional incompetence, maybe, intentional confusion, because what Jeremy Corbyn wants to do and what his team want to do is to keep the poll ratings high. So to do that, they need to keep on board young people, many of whom, of course, voted to remain within the EU in June last year, and then voters who supported your party, UKIP, who felt that Jeremy Corbyn was actually, and I think the term you used was a proper chap, and was to get on board. So
I thought for a bit he was, and he's now completely turned his back on it. And I did say, Theo, he was almost a proper chap.
Almost a proper chap. Well, I tell you what, Conor Burns, the Conservative MP, a long-time friend of the late Baroness Thatcher, has a fairly dim view of Labour.
Gradually acquired all the attributes of statehood: a citizenship, a flag, an anthem, a currency, a parliament, and a Supreme Court. For me, it became the antithesis of what an independent nation-state was all about. And those of us who campaigned to leave were very clear in our objectives. We wanted to make our own laws in this country. We wanted to sign our own trade deals. And we wanted to end the massive payments to the European Union and decide on our own immigration policy. Mr. Speaker, that is what this bill sets us on the road to do.
Now, in all efforts to be balanced and impartial on this, I just want to bring in Chris Bryant, of course, a former Shadow Minister, who gave this impassioned plea that this was a power grab by the government.
Mr. Speaker, this bill is utterly pernicious. It is dangerous. It is fundamentally un-British, and I think that it has at its heart a lie. It pretends to bring back power to this country, but it actually represents the biggest peacetime power grab by the executive over the legislature, by the government over Parliament in 100 years. It allows the government to drive through changes to any law, by the simple fiat of a minister.
The detail is important on this story and what we're going to see tonight in terms of the result and the government a decent government win, and that is that Conservative MPs, backbenchers, are saying, let's make the changes later on when it gets to committee stage, because that way we're not going to obstruct the government in what it actually has to do by bringing forward this legislation and bringing EU laws into British law. What Labour's doing, they claim, is cynically trying to kibosh the bill, because of course that could force it would lead to the undermining of government, possibly even the proroguing of Parliament and then you're into territory about the future of the government.
We will see this now in committee stage, and maybe that gets more interesting. And Thea, thank you, and I apologise to you because I said you were the BBC's political correspondent.
Boo hiss.
And no, but you're about to find out why, Theo, because folks, I have the BBC very much on my mind. Do you remember last August? A man was killed. A man was murdered, we were told, in Harlow in Essex. That was the story. And the BBC ran this in a big, big way. And they said the crime was regarded as a race-hate killing triggered by the Brexit vote of 2 months earlier. And the coverage, not just from the BBC, but from many, but it was worse from the BBC. The coverage got worse because BBC's Newsnight, John Sweeney, went to Harlow. He recorded a package. He spoke to a friend of the man that had died in the street. And the Polish fella said, well, I don't want to name names. And Sweeney said, oh, go on, name names. He said, well, Nigel Farage now has blood on his hands. And how well I remember that news report. And I remember people picking up off the back of it, believing it to be true. Well, I can tell you that this has all come to court. And actually, in many ways, it was the other way round. Yes, there were a group of young youths hanging about in a shopping centre in Harlow. But they were confronted by a couple of Polish fellas who clearly had had too much to drink. Indeed, the Defence Council made the point that the racist remarks were made to the British youths and invited violence from those youngsters. So a 15-year-old boy punched the Polish man, Mr. Joswick, who unfortunately fell down on the ground, cracked his head and died. And I have to say that since this judgment last Friday, and despite the fact that many have written in to the BBC demanding that something is done, all they have done is put up 280 words on their BBC Essex website just to talk about the judgment of the court. And frankly, I am disgusted with this. What the BBC did was actually to directly promote hatred, division, not just within our communities, but directly against me. And frankly, this isn't good enough. I demand an apology from the journalist who cooked up this story, who egged on the witness in the way that he did, and I should be writing to Lord Hall, the Director General of the BBC, demanding an apology. It is outrageous that we all pay this money, we're forced to, or we go to prison, for an organisation that pretends to be a neutral broadcaster and in reality is anything but. You know, Channel 4, who perhaps have a reputation for being on the left of centre, Channel 4 did a report from Harlow where they said this wasn't about race hate, it was about gang violence and about bad behaviour and the police losing control on the streets. I don't often get on my high horse like this, but I think, you know, for it to be put out there that I have blood on my hands, for me to be subjected continually to threats and violence and have to surround myself in security to even go out in London and buy a newspaper, and it's all caused by journalism like this. And you know what? I've pretty much had my fill of it. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, live from here in Strasbourg. The time now is 7:45. It's Juncker's big State of the Union speech on Wednesday here in Strasbourg. What should he do? Should he, as we expect him to, push hard for deeper integration and move it towards the United States of Europe, or should he, in my view, learn the lessons of Brexit and hand some powers and democracy back to voters and member states? So what should he say? What should I say in this debate? Donald says on Facebook, you can say what you like to Mr Juncker, Nigel. He won't listen anyway. Well, that's probably true, Donald, but you never know. Kathy thinks that Juncker should close the whole thing down, as it won't stand up for long anyway. No, he doesn't believe that, Kathy. For him, it is a religion. Adam says, what do you expect Juncker to do? He needs to protect the interests of 28 countries, not just the UK. Adam, it's a good point, but I wonder, is he protecting the interests of those countries, companies, workers, families, or has the EU become all about Brussels and Strasbourg and the institutions and the people that live and breathe and work within it? Which I suspect a little bit. Charlie in Cardiff is my next caller. Charlie, what do you think Mr Juncker should do on Wednesday? Is he right to want to deepen the European project?
Hello, Nigel.
Good evening.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, I would like to make the EU a fully federal union, a United States of Europe, and have decisions made at the most appropriate level of government. So actually that would mean some powers would be devolved to national governments.
Well, that's very nice of them, isn't it, Charlie?
Well, that's the way I would like to do it. And knowing that you're a fan of the United States of America, I would like to ask you, would you support the United States of Europe, or do you think the USA is not a good model of government?
I think the USA was a case, Charlie, of people leaving behind their pasts and going with a blank sheet of paper to make a completely fresh start. And I think despite all of that, they suffered to get where they are today, one of the bloodiest civil wars that any country has ever been through. But they did have the advantage of common languages, common cultures. And yeah, I know there was lots of German spoken, but basically common language, common culture. So I don't think there's any comparison between Europe with its antiquity and America with its fresh start. But I tell you what, Charlie, you've got a view. You are a believer in the flag, the anthem, and goodness knows what else. And I think you're very much in the minority. So let me ask you, if you think Juncker on Wednesday is heading in the right direction, should I say to him, well, Mr Juncker, the pal of yours called Charlie in Cardiff thinks you're absolutely bang on the money, but would you, Mr Juncker, and would you, Charlie in Cardiff, support the United States of Europe only being formed if people had the chance to support it in a full, free and fair referendum?
Yes, definitely.
Yes. Fine. Good. Yeah. No, well, Charlie, I tell you what, this is what I love about politics, that I can chat to people like Charlie in Cardiff, who was rung in before, who feels very strongly on this issue, and we disagree fundamentally. But, Charlie, we're both Democrats, and we have a civil conversation, don't we?
We do. Yeah, and I enjoy it.
Me too. Good, thank you very much indeed. OK, well, Charlie, a regular with a very strong point of view, but from him to a first-time caller, John in Barnet. John, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel.
Good evening. So what should Juncker say to Europe, or what should I say to Juncker, John?
Well, I'm not a supporter of the European project, but I do think that perhaps the only option left is to try and pursue a full federal state, because right now Europe sits in a sort of limbo state where it's half a state, but it pretends it's not a state, so it won't take all the powers a normal state would have. Now, if you look at, say, the euro could work a lot better if there was the sort of flow of money internally that you'd have with a currency like the pound. So there are richer areas in the UK, there are poorer areas in the UK, money flows between them. So a lot of the problems with Europe could be solved if you went down a full federal route.
So if the Germans and the Dutch and the Finns, for example, were prepared to continually transfer their money in larger quantities to Greece and to Italy and to countries like that, it might work better, John, yeah?
Yes. I don't think it would be a good thing, but I do think
I agree with you. I agree with you in that sense, John. Maybe actually on this call we do find agreement that the European project's got to go one way or the other. It's a bit in limbo land. I agree with that, because what they did was they set up an economic and monetary union without a political union being in place, and they thought as night followed day, one would follow the other, and it's not happening. All I would say to you, John, from my knowledge of it, is the voters of Northern Europe have become increasingly angry. about the prospect of further financial transfers to the south. You've got the east of Europe, or say the east, it's actually Central Europe, the Czech Republic, but what we call the east of Europe, saying to Brussels, saying to Merkel, we don't want your migrant quotas. And John, I would have thought if they want to save the European project and keep it as a cooperative trading group of friends, albeit with a bit of politics, John, I would have thought what they've got to do is hand some powers back.
Well, you might be right there, but on the same time, you can either have it go one way or the other, and they're pretty much locked into their dream of a federal Europe. You're not going to persuade these people to go back.
Do you know what, John? Whatever I say on Wednesday morning, I'm not going to persuade Mr. Juncker. You're absolutely right. Thank you for the call, John. John saying the logic is they have to go further, otherwise it can never work. In economic terms, John is probably right. In political terms, I'm not sure it's doable. And another first-time caller, Russ in Orpington. Good evening.
Hi, Nigel. You were speaking earlier on about something you should say to Jean-Claude Juncker tomorrow. I think perhaps if you said to him that Europe was a busted flush, and if he wanted to prove you wrong, he could offer the other 27 nations a referendum
on their future and whether they want a United States of Europe along the lines that he's building, Russ, yeah?
Yeah, same as we've done.
And have you got any thought on this? I mean, if they did have a referendum and ask people across Europe, do you want this to become a much more centralised, full state? You got any guess, Russ, what the peoples of Europe would say?
I would imagine the richer countries in Europe would go the same way as we've gone.
Yeah, they'd simply say no.
Yeah, the politicians want to be in the EU, but I think people generally don't.
No, but
and
Russ...
I can't see why the man in the street in Germany or the man in the street in France should think any differently to how I think.
Well, do you know what, Russ? My experience of travelling around is that generally they don't. And, I tell you a funny thing. When we had the EU constitution all those years ago, Luxembourg had a referendum, right? And I went to Luxembourg and spoke in the only opposition meeting. And it was me, a Danish politician and a professor and about 10 people in the room. And despite the fact that over 15% of Luxembourg's gross domestic product came directly from the European institutions based there, despite all of that, 44% of Luxembourgers said no to the European Constitution. So, Russ, I'm with you. I think right across Europe, I think people feel as we do. And I think Juncker is making perhaps a terrible mistake. Russ, I thank you very much indeed for your call. And my last caller this evening is going to be Jeff in Redditch. Jeff, what should Juncker do?
I don't think it really matters what Mr. Juncker does, really. My sort of view is he can talk through his backside if he wants. The reality of life is, unless he gets the French and the Germans to replace the money that they ain't going to get from us, nothing's going to happen. And I just look at Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece. I look at the northern countries, Hungary and those. Nobody seems to actually be getting the benefit of this European thing. And I'd just love to know what is good about Europe.
There's lots good about Europe, Jeff. If we're talking Europe and we're talking diversity and different countries and languages and wines and cheeses, it's fabulous. What is good about the project that aims to pull all these different people and force them into one? Jeff, I can't find it for the life of me. Has the European project had its day, Jeff, in your view?
I think it's at its day. And as far as the BBC goes, we have a local monument round here in the West Midlands called the Hagley Monument, stuck up for nothing and not quite straight. Every time I listen to the BBC, all you get out of the BBC is innuendo. They don't tell all the story, only tell half the story. When they talk about the pound against the euro or the pound against the dollar, it's going down.
And when there's a good story, Jeff, they say despite Brexit. Despite Brexit, consumer spending was up 2.8% year-on-year, August to August. Despite Brexit, industrial production is up this year. Despite Brexit, I mean, Jeff, I've had enough of it. No doubt, next it's going to be a sunny day tomorrow, despite Brexit. Jeff, I thank you. Lorraine suggests just stand up, do a Noel Edmonds impression, and say no deal, Mr. Juncker. I might well do that. look, we've had a good debate about Juncker. I've had my say about the BBC, about which I am personally very, very angry. My final thought is that Juncker and the EU are not learning anything from the referendum that we had in the United Kingdom, and they will alienate people even more deeply. You've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show, live from Strasbourg. I'm back tomorrow evening from 7. Coming up at 10, it's Ian Collins, but up next, it's Clivesville.
Thanks very much, Nigel. So at 9, it's the Business Hour. I'm going to be joined by Emma Jones, business expert, to advise on starting up a business. If you've got something in mind, you've already done it and you've hit problems, or you're just thinking about it, call us at 9. Special guest for the Business Hour this week as well, Mike Suter, who's chairman of Shortlist and Stylist magazine, and also one of those very tough interviewers on The Apprentice. First, though, Labour is attempting to